start.
Tell us where did it start? When did you decide to make a movie with this little budget, found footage, a new, totally different way to make a movie? How did you decide to do that?
Well, it started because I was approached about doing a documentary about the Chesapeake Bay and what's going on there and all of the ecological issues. But I thought, I thought as a storyteller, it occurred to me it might be more interesting to tell it, as a storyteller rather than a documentary. And then I was thinking, well, how to do it. And then that's how it evolved to what this is. But see, when somebody talked about found footage, I never really even thought about it. First of all, I never really think about genres because of the work that I do. I don't know where I fit anyway, so the idea of a genre didn't occur to me. But I thought of the movie as if I were going to do an archaeological dig, but you were digging up what's all around you now, which is all of the digital cameras and all of the internet stuff and everything else that's available, and that's how you tell the story. Because all of this stuff is going to be available. It's not like you go back to Pompeii. If somebody got out of there, they'd say, you're not going to believe what happened when one person telling the story. Nowadays, all of this stuff is part of it. So the incident that took place in that one day is collected and put together to try to reconstruct what took place.
And these new techniques, did you discover new ways to tell stories? It was a refreshing experience. Or?
Well, I mean, it is. I mean, the language of film continues to change from, the silent era on. And so it continues to evolve, and all of this kind of, digital stuff is going to continue to change the language of film. It's inevitable. And so in this particular case, you're taking these things on, and you say, all right, so we'll shoot with an iPhone, we'll shoot with this. I mean, anybody that had a camera that day was doing it, whether or not it applied to the specific story or it was peripheral to it, they were doing things during that given day, and that's how you put it together.
There is plenty of material in the film that comes from real life. Mm-hmm. For instance, the plague of dead fishes arrived it occurs in the bay, and also the Simotoa parasite actually exists.
The parasite?
The parasite that you show on the Wikipedia page. Why did you choose to build the premises of your film on an authentic base like this?
Why build it on an authentic base
Uh-huh.
as opposed to just imaginary?
Exactly.
One, I think it's just better storytelling if you can use enough things that are in fact credible. I think it becomes ultimately more unsettling, that there is this reality that's constantly infusing the piece. So that the fact that isopods were originally in the West Coast have now come into the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that they go from being sea lice and then turning into crustaceans. The fact that the amount of dumpage of steroids into the water that begins to mutate things. All those things which are real allow you to build a base, for this piece of work.
And regarding actually this subject, it was really powerful, and I really discovered after watching the film that it was a reality, and it's really scary. And how you were interested in this subject before you get the script, or how? Because I was so surprised, like reading in a press book, that it was a reality we couldn't imagine.
Well, I mean, it's pretty amazing. I mean, I'm not a, you might say, like, an environmentalist that I belong to some organizations and whatever. I mean, I'm aware of it. I'm aware of the deterioration of, say, the Chesapeake Bay, from the time I was a kid to now. Originally you could go into the Chesapeake Bay and it was grass bottom. You'd walk and it'd be grass. There would come around your legs, you know, and that's all gone. Now it's just a muddy bottom. I mean, that's in my lifetime. But I'll never forget, because my brother-in-law has a place, you know, on the water at Chesapeake Bay, and someone was visiting next door, and he was a, you know, kid, 20 years old, and he had a cut on his leg, and he fell into the water. And when they got out, they had to take him over to the hospital, and he had to get like 5 different antibiotic shots because they didn't know which ones would or wouldn't work. But they're just fearful because of the stuff that's in the water, including the flesh-eating bacteria that does exist in the Chesapeake Bay. That doesn't mean everybody jumps in the bay, they're going to get flesh-eating bacteria, but it does exist. It didn't before, but it does now. So I think sometimes with certain, what you might consider, you know, a film of this type, you take certain parts of factual information and then you build this particular piece. It's not a 100%, you know, stamped authentic, you know, but it has enough components to play with that, you know, can unnerve us as we watch the piece.
Was it hard for you to balance the realistic aspect, because it's the Bay is part a documentary and 50% an horror movie, and that was something that is pretty new for you. And when you see the movie, the horror,
The what?
The horror.
The horror.
The horror.
French accent. And was it hard for you to deal with this new aspect in your work? Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think it's part of, you know, as a filmmaker, I mean, for me, you always want to sort of push your own comfort zone. You want to keep expanding out in some fashion, rather than keep doing what you're doing. So for me, it was interesting to say, gee, I wonder if this would be scary if this were to happen, and then have to find a way to make it credible, because it just isn't going to be one of the movies where it's just big pop-outs happening. You got to find a way to make it real, and to make it.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's the thing that makes the fear more effective, because it came from the bacteria, the isopod, and they are real. So when the movie switched to more graphic, it became more graphic. You are always stressed by the fact that you think that this thing can happen. So
yeah.
I don't know.
Well, that was kind of what you want to try to do, is build, you know, just building these blocks as they go along. You know, just keep building on it. You know, in other words, if something is totally not credible somewhere in the middle of it, you know, or in the early part of it, then your building blocks aren't in shape, then you have nowhere to go. Then all you can do is find a way to scare somebody. But you have to, it's literally like taking step by step by step, and if you answer it correctly. In other words, in the design of the movie, there are certain rules that we have to obey, because if we don't obey them, then the movie has no credibility. Others are going to have a young boy and a young girl down by the water. There's only one camera, which means there cannot be multiple cameras. There's only one camera. So how do you do it? So he's filming her, she gets bored, she takes the camera from him, he's wandering away, he's going there, he grabs the camera back from her, she goes onto the dock. This whole conversation's going on, right? It's all one shot. She jumps into the water, he's filming her, something goes wrong, and he jumps into the water, and then the camera basically goes floating into the water, and we see all this activity. So it can only be one shot. If we start doing cutaways, then subconsciously we begin to think, well, this doesn't seem credible. So if you watch the movie, and not that you have to pay attention to it, but you begin to sense it feels very real. In other words, if a police car is answering a distress call, that police car starts 5 blocks away from the action and keeps going down the streets and around the corner and then pulling up, and then the cops get out and they're walking around in front of the car, and now we see them again, and the sheriff comes over and they're having a conversation. It's only one shot, and the shot starts 6 blocks away. So if I start covering the scene, then there's no credibility. So you have to figure out, how do you do these scenes without coverage. You know, so even in the scene when the sheriff pulls up and he gets out of the car with the other policemen and there's a killing, you know, the killing, it's all one shot, right? So the sheriff gets shot and then the policeman shoots himself. It's one shot. It doesn't even cut in between. So you have to figure out how to do that. It's like a puzzle. You know, how do I do this? How do I, you know, and that's part of the fun of it too.
You were particularly interested by the kaleidoscope puzzle way of making a film. Is it a good way to scare people, this kind of puzzle?
Well, I mean, it was just a way that seemed to make sense for what I have to do. You know, it was compatible as to how you make the movie. So I mean, that's all I had to go by, you know. So, you know, the script, it wasn't like I found the script and then I did it. And we developed the script, and the script is basically gonna evolve out of the about how to approach it. So that's how the script and the technique. It's not like you're imposing one idea on the other. They sort of evolve together. If that answers what you were saying.
I was trying to understand why you choose this specific, because you could have find other ways to tell this particular stories. Why this kaleidoscope of a webcam, Skype stuff, you know?
Well, I'm not sure how else you tell the story. You know what I mean? I mean, I think this was the only way I could think to tell the story, is in fact this is the way it was done. So in other words, it was so inherent in the piece that this is like the only way I could figure out how to tell it. Because if I use more traditional techniques, then everything that's in the movie won't work. You know, it only works because there was a surveillance camera at that time. That there was only that they were on Skype because that's the only way they could have communicated. You know, so it evolves that way.
Je reprécise un truc qu'il a dit tout à l'heure qui vous a peut-être échappé mais qui explique ça, c'est que à partir du moment où il dit que c'est comme des fouilles, comme un endroit, comme des fouilles archéologiques qui sont mises à jour, donc il part du principe que ça a été filmé ce jour-là par les gens qui vivent là. Donc, il suffit de lister comment on filme un endroit quand on n'est pas extérieur, donc c'est que les gens qui y sont. Et à partir du moment où vous ressortez ce qui a été filmé, bah vous faites comme ce qui a été filmé. Donc c'est pas un œil extérieur. I was explaining what you said at the beginning about Pompeii and finding archival footage. It has to be shot like a real thing, and then you take it out.
Yes.
And is this why you? Because I think I remember that at the beginning there was maybe not this girl at the beginning, on the opening scene, kind of getting settled to tell the story. How did that idea come up? Of this girl who kind of makes a link between now and the time when that thing happened.
You mean she's sitting there and they're talking to her? And
yeah, that was not there at the beginning when I read the script, I remember.
No, it wasn't. Well, a lot of things got added while it was being shot. Because while it was being shot, I thought of all different kinds of things to try. And so, as an example, there's a young girl who was showing that she's got blisters and she's in the bathroom, and then she ends up at the hospital. That's not in the script. There was a young girl there, and it was a day player, and I thought she was interesting. So I had her do this thing, and then it basically was just I would explain it, and then let her go and shoot the thing in the bathroom, talking to her friend, and then I would look at it on the iPhone and I'd say, well, look, do this instead, and say this, and then send her back in there, and come out and look at it again. And then I liked her, so I kept adding her throughout the movie. So you just find, in this kind of form, you find other things to keep adding to it. So it becomes a fair amount of invention during the process of shooting it.
When you write a movie like that with different segments in the movie, do you write the film from the beginning to the end, or do you write every segment individual, and then after you put together the different segments to the...
No, it's got to have a beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? If you have the beginning, middle, and end, then you might fool around with stuff, and you may even move things around. but it has a natural progression to it, because certain things won't move around. They can only happen in this point in time, if that's clear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfectly.
You can play with character,
Yeah.
but its structure is inherent. It has to be in place.
Okay.
We feel in the movie from the beginning till the end that there's more than just the suspects, there's more than just the horror. And does it have to happen the 4th of July? Because behind there's something very violent, and that makes things worse. Does the action has to take place the 4th of July?
Does it have to take place on the
Yeah.
4th of July? No, I mean, nothing has to take place on the 4th of July.
It's very symbolic.
Yes, it is, but because of the activities going on, I mean, you know, we could have invented the July 27th crab feast if we wanted, you know what I mean? Except, you know, the July 4th crab eating contest is one element, but the other being is there's less news on that day, you know what I mean? Because if you're going to a place like that, there's less from the outside world. That's why you end up with this one reporter, send the young girl there for who wants to go on July 4th anywhere. So it's the most down day in a sense of covering something like a place like that. That would have been more of the reason than anything else. I mean, we could have invented a holiday of our own, just, you know, for the Chesapeake Bay that day.
And do you have an idea of how many people in the United States know what's happening at the Chesapeake Bay?
I'd say probably 98% probably would not know. And vice versa, we wouldn't know about some other areas of the country where there are other issues. You know what I mean? And we're getting into a situation that's getting more and more complicated, because we're talking about much more sophisticated kind of chemicals that are being used. It's not like, you know, like, oh well, it's waste going into the water. Okay, I got it. But this is far more sophisticated and far more deadly. In fact, you know, even now they'll say in the Chesapeake Bay that we do not use steroids for, you know, chicken growth. And then if you say, well, what do you use? They say, well, that's proprietary interest, and we don't have to let you know that. And you say, well, what makes a chicken grow, you know, to 6 pounds in 42 days? It used to take 6 months if it's not steroids. And they say, well, I mean, you know, we have other methods. So, I mean, you know, the fact that you're dumping that, and there are all these kind of aberrations taking place in the Chesapeake Bay, for one, and other parts of the country. Things that go on that, you know, and I'm sure, you know, worldwide. There is the issue, you know, there is that issue of what's in the water that no one is smart enough to understand unless everyone wants to really address it. And everybody understands the economics of it. I mean, none of us are, you know, saying, oh, I don't care, you know, do this, do that. There is this balance that you have to figure out. So in doing this kind of movie, you want to say, well, look, this is going on, and I can take it and I can bend it over here, and we can create our own kind of storytelling, you know, based on some information.
Is it hard to make a scary movie about water so many years after Jaws?
Yeah, it is, except for the one difference is between Jaws and this would be if you got out of the water in Jaws, you were safe.
Here it's only the beginning.
Yeah.
Right. That's a very good catchline.
There is a sequence in the bay when the teenager is dying in the water with his boyfriend. Is it an homage to Jaws, to the opening sequence of Jaws? Because when I saw the movie, I think, whoa, it's just exactly like the opening scene of Jaws.
Was it an homage?
Was it an homage?
No, I never liked the idea of an homage, you know what I mean? But you're going to have, what I said to you is that, you know, that getting out of the water is the least of our worries. Anything happening in the water of which there is something violent, we're always going to think of Jaws because that was an indelible, you know, movie in that regard. So there's always going to be that. The question is, where are we going from that point? You can't get around it. Anybody in the water splashing.
We have a French singer, very famous, who said in French, "On nous cache tout, on ne dit rien," which was a song.
Which means everything is hidden from us and we're not being told anything.
Oh.
And to me, when I saw your film, I mean, there is the reality. I mean, the reality is au-delà de la fiction.
It's beyond.
It's beyond the fiction, always.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. I mean, a lot of things you find out were way worse than, in fact, what we knew. But we are entering into a time now of cause and effect that is way beyond what we would have dabbled with in the past. That is a fact. And so, look, in the movie, when there's a point where he pulls a little teeny, you know, sort of the very beginning of an isopod, and he's holding it up, you know, to a magnifying glass, and a little thing is moving. And he says, you know, that they've been around for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, etc. That wasn't a CGI shot. That was a fish that actually had that on it. Sea lice, they're referred to in their earliest stages of development. So we didn't even have to do it. We just pulled it out of the water, and there it was. It was on the fish.
Super scary.
And that will go into the fish's gills, and then basically as it evolves, we'll eat the fish from the inside out, and that is for real.
That is true. So what do we eat now? Yeah. You cannot eat fish, what do we eat?
Right.
And look at the chicken, how they're fed, you cannot eat eggs. I mean, really,
right.
It's really scary. What can you eat?
Well, carrots seem to be okay.
There's a way you show the scientists, the red cell, all the scientists are expecting for the big question, and they are unable to answer. It's just a creation? It's just your imagination? Or are you inspired by because it looks like the outline of a beautiful web show. It's pathetic. All those scientists waiting in a little room and doing nothing, expecting. It's far away from the scientists we saw on the TV that look like heroes and are searching.
You mean the CDC when they're trying to sort something out?
Right.
Yeah, the image you gave of it,
well, because they have to play a catch-up game at times where they don't understand, you know, what something is. So it's not like we immediately know. I mean, they're going through every imaginable scenario they can figure out, and part of the fun is that they're looking at it from some kind of virus, and so that's got them on the wrong track, you know. So they're trying to deal with viruses, etc. And then they're kind of going through it. I mean, this is what they're trying to figure out in one day. So I think that's the fun of they're going through all of the kind of, you know, possibilities. It's not like we got these, you know, grand old men sitting in a room and all I have to do is tell you one thing and they'll say, okay, here's what it is. It's complicated. And how fast do they figure out what's going on? And then, of course, if they figure it out, that doesn't mean there's a solution.
Before you made the movie, did you have the opportunity to have a talk with this kind of scientists?
Well, we saw a bunch of stuff on it, but the interesting thing enough is in the beginning of the movie where you see all these clips of dead fish and everything else, I mean, all we did was take that off television. I mean, that's all for real. I didn't invent that. 250,000 dead fish come up on the shores of New Jersey, 150,000 dead here, birds falling out of the sky.
It looks like a scene from Magnolia, and you couldn't believe it.
Yeah, so those are all real things that are there. In fact, while we were filming, there were, you know, scenarios. In the Chesapeake Bay, there was a fish kill of a 500,000 dead fish floated up to the surface. So that all goes on, and the seagulls won't eat them.
Huh.
So that stuff goes on. Now, they can give you a lot of explanations, but you don't have to go back and say, well, let me ask you, how many times were there dead fish floating to the surface in 1938? 1947, how many times were there 500,000 fish float to the surface? You know, so these are obviously certain things that are going on that make you wonder. Now, that just adds to the piece.
But weren't you afraid that to make a horror movie, which is a fun movie, fun to watch, was going to lessen the strength of the message?
Lessen the strength of the message?
You are not afraid of that?
No, I don't think things go that would lessen it. I think if anything, it just makes you a little bit more aware. I think if you find out about something, I don't think you become less, you know.
What I mean is that people who go and see horror movies, they go for the thrill of it. They don't expect to remember the movie once they're out of the theater. So that's the trick, because they come here for the thrill and they get out with something they didn't expect to get.
No, and then if they talk about it afterwards, that just becomes the additional thing. I mean, that's what I know when we had some panel discussions after some of the screenings, the conversation can go on and on and on. Because there's all this wonder about this. And of course nowadays, you just pull it up on the internet. And all you say is, go ahead and pull up, isopods. And all of a sudden up come pictures and pictures and pictures and stories and everything else.
But what I mean is, in a way, if you would have made a drama about the Chesapeake Bay, you think people would not have want to come. That's why you wanted to make a horror movie out of it?
Well, I mean, will they come or not? Or how much will they be affected by it? My guess is probably not by a lot. I don't think we sort of, you know, it's like if you were to do something about the roller coaster that jumped the tracks, you know, that everybody stopped going onto the roller coaster. You know, I mean, they still went.
You were saying that you love to push your limits, and for example, if in 5 years you have the opportunity to do a follow-up to the Bay, what would be your desire to do with that project? What would you change? What would you experiment? Or would you decide that was not a good idea?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what would you do. I mean, I've never looked at the following up of anything that I've done. I mean, I've done Baltimore stories, but if you're talking about simply on the science level of it.
Yeah, I was saying that because there is a big documentary aspect, so that would be what next? After maybe 5 years, 10 years, does the situation goes down?
Well, I think that's for documentary people to do. You know what I mean? In other words, I don't have a documentary, you know, about the health of the Chesapeake Bay. I'm using that as the jumping off point for this, to tell this story. So, you know, that wouldn't be something I would think about. If you were doing a documentary and then you want to come back and do it in 5 years, it would be interesting. And maybe some of the documentary people who covered it, you know, that have covered it in the past, might want to look at it in 10 years and say, okay, so where are we now compared to where it was then?
I was wondering because about the form, which is, I mean, the horror film, but it's more a political film. That's really what I think, and I mean, the strength is to touch more people. I think this is your goal.
Than a documentary.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, or more than a drama, because the horror film is like from the young population to, I mean, it touches everybody. And you have a political message in a way, or you make aware the people through this form of this kind of film. So for you it was the better
way to touch the younger generation.
Talk about this.
Yeah, I think so, because it's not as dry as a documentary. I mean, here you got characters you get involved in and wonder, you know, what's going to happen to them, and are they going to survive, and how do they deal with one another, and all that. So I think that I mean, that's where, you know, a theatrical experience is, you know, differs from the documentary. And if you went back to the 30s, there were a lot of documentaries on the 30s and the Dust Bowl and the poverty and the Depression. And then there was John Steinbeck's The Great Sarath, you know, and which was made into a movie by John Ford, and which it dealt with all of that in a storytelling fashion. You know, still explored many of the same issues, but you're dealing with it through character, through behavior, as well as the canvas of what's taking place.
But to me, at the same time, it's you touch the young generation, which is important, I mean, to the future, so that's why maybe it's...
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be nice if somehow people saw something and then all of a sudden there was some kind of movement to do something? I mean, that would be great.
Occupy the water.
Could we say also that it's a basic kind of an example to give? I mean, we are entering moments where it's getting urgent, it's getting worse and worse, and we have to find medias to shock, to push people. And is debate the example that you just have to take easiest ways to take pictures and bring back the image to the most people, the most numerous people? Even if it's a fiction, even if it's a...
Yeah, you know, but you know, you get into an area it's very hard to define in this way. In the 60s, nuclear proliferation was an ongoing issue, right? Now, there were two movies that were done. One was Fail-Safe, which was about, the fact that a nuclear, weapon, got out of control and etc. And the same story was told in Dr. Strangelove about what happens if some maniac decides that he's going to go, launch a missile attack or a bomb attack on Russia, the Soviet Union. Certainly a very real scenario that can happen if something gets out of control because we're playing with nuclear weapons. And that was on the minds of everybody going, holy God, what in the world's going to happen? We got all these nuclear weapons, what's going to happen? And so two movies were done in two different styles. One in a very dramatic fashion and the other in a very dark comedic fashion. Very real subject, all the things they were talking about in the real, how the plane was flying and checklist and this and that, all 100% real, right? How the radar systems, etc., all of that stuff was 100% real, and they blew up the world in the movie, in both. Blew up the world, right? Now, I don't know how many people took to the streets the following afternoon and said, this is getting crazy, we're going to have to do something, we're going to all get wiped out. But it was all based on, real scenarios.
So the little difference is that it was a threat, there was a risk. Now we are beyond the risk. Things are happening in front of us.
Right. What do we do and how do we respond? And that's hard for any of us to gauge what that means.
Could we say that the director of the bay is somewhere furious?
Could you say that the director of the bay is?
Is somewhere furious.
Ah, that you're furious.
Furious.
Yeah.
Furious.
Well, yeah, because the irony is you can do much better. You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be pristine and perfect, but we can certainly do better than what we do. There is no question about that. But it does get into the fact of profits have to be maximized. So if they made 3% less, on their profit base, and you had this much, benefit from it, wouldn't it be a better equation? But that's not the way the modern economics work.
It shows really the absurdity of our world at the same time.
Absolutely.
And how do people from this area react to your film?
Well, I think that, a lot of them, like everything else, you only pay a certain amount of attention to it because you're bombarded with all kinds of other things. I mean, look, if you take in the United States right now, they're having a big argument about gun control. 90% of Americans believe that there should be background checks on people who get guns. 90% of the Americans, and they cannot move that through Congress. And then you say, well, why is that? And everybody knows the reason. The reason is real simple. It's money. that the munitions company pay off the senators and the congresspeople not to pass legislation which is detrimental to the munitions company. So therefore, it just gets stuck when 90% of Americans want it.
And the president.
And the president. But no one wants to say, which is the real, you know, which is the open, dirty secret, is there's too much money here at stake. And we don't want anything that might slow down the amount of profits that can be made. That's the reality, but no one wants to talk about it that way. So they keep saying, well, we're trying to move through the thing, and everybody talks in this nice, polite language. But that's the reality of it. So, it's off the topic, but that's how things get tweaked around, and then it comes out to be something different than what was really on the table. I mean, it's really bizarre. I mean, you know, because sometimes you'll read about, well, you know, there's a new influenza, and the people in the United States are really upset. You could be upset because 37 people came down with an influenza, right? And then you were to say, well, how many people get killed with guns per year in the United States? It's 35,000 per year. If you go from the time that John Lennon was killed, I think I read something recently, when that was the thing about we have to have some kind of gun control. Since he was shot and killed, 1 million Americans have been killed. And no one, everybody's saying, well, we got to come up with a proposal, and everybody knows there isn't going to be any proposals. It'll all be like Band-Aid stuff because of the amount of money is at stake. So, it's off the topic, but...
No, it's the same topic. Yeah, somehow it is.
But do you think the notion of subversivity of movies?
What's that?
The notion of subversive movie, that's, well, quite disappeared. Had to come back?
Well, I think look, we're in a period right now where it's very difficult to have, you know, movies about human beings. I mean, that is a difficult thing. Most of it is directed to that one, you know, bells and whistle, you know, piece. And not to say there's not a place for it, but right now we're out of balance. There isn't some kind of a better balance of all kinds of movies, you know, that can succeed. And I'm not talking about you have to be really esoteric. You know, there are some very, you know, there's more that can be put on the table than there is, and that may change, you know, as we move down the road. But, you know, that's where we are. So I think that there's a greater appetite out there right now than what's being put on the plate.
Il y a un point à gauche là qu'on n'a pas entendu du tout.
I'm saying that the left corner is very quiet.
The what?
The left corner is very quiet.
What do you think of the actual found footage movies, such as Paranormal Activity?
I don't know. You know, I'm not, as I say, I'm not a real like genre fan that I go to see all of the genre of anything. You know, I've seen, you know, one or the two of the, you might say, the paranormal, and I don't normally race out to go see any one thing. I'm just whatever my interest might be. But as I say, it's all part of film language, you know, and as it goes, you know, because on one hand, there's several things that work. One is that the more accessible a camera becomes, there's more ways to tell a story.
Yeah.
And there's also the demythification of what film represents. There was a time when film, you know, was much more of a magical thing, because it wasn't in the hands of everybody. It was magic. You know, I mean, only a few people had it. Only a few people can do it. I mean, when I was a little kid, I went to the movie theater, and there was a big red curtain when you went in. It was just a big red curtain, and then eventually it would open up, and you didn't see the screen. You saw another curtain. And then through that curtain, you would see there was a screen, you know, and then they would part and you go, whoa, and now the show would begin. And that was a big deal. Now if you walk into a theater in the States, I can't speak for here, then there's ads up on there on the thing, you know, it's like for a candy, for whatever, you know, for a repair shop or whatever it is. I mean, so it's not glorious, the glorious screen. It's changed. We have a new relationship to it. That doesn't mean it disappears. I don't think it disappears. I think there's a communal thing which is very valuable, where a bunch of people go together to see something and enjoy it as an event. I think that's in our DNA. You know, whether we watched in amphitheaters in the past or whatever, there is this thing of everybody laughing together, or suddenly, you know, screaming together, or whatever, or emotionally being connected together, not individually, you know, sitting on a cell phone in a corner, you know, watching it. There is that, and that's part of our DNA. But it does change and it does evolve.
Yeah. And do you miss this era of magic movies?
Well, I do, because I grew up in it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But if I were to say, you know, to some kid who's 15 years old and doesn't know about it, he doesn't miss it because it never existed.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a little kid and I went to the movie theater, you know, and there were ushers, people in uniforms, you know, that was right this way, you know, and you go into a seat and put a uniform in. I mean, it was like a big thing. I mean, you know, so as a kid, that was quite amazing. And then when we went to see, when I started to grow up, and we started to get an automobile, and then we would go, and then there were the art house theaters, which I had, you know, I never even knew existed, and then that's where I saw all these French films. But the thing that we always remembered about going to see those movies, they had really nice seats, and they sort of would rock back and forth. They were sort of more modern. And when you went to see a French film, somehow they were sort of so special, they didn't sell popcorn.
Really?
Yeah, no popcorn. No, this must be a very special movie. And we'd sit there, you know, and that's where I saw, you know, that's where I saw all the French films and the New Wave and everything else. We went and we suddenly saw things which we had never seen. So this was all part of the learning of it all, and then that became, you know, there was that period in America, which was very different. You had, you know, but it was still the glory of what cinema was.
Yeah.
So it evolves. Doesn't mean we stopped going. It evolves, you know. So there is a difference. I mean, when I first saw a French film, you had to read subtitles. It was like, what? You know, I'm looking around the screen like that, you know. And I was always fascinated because it seemed like they were saying a whole lot more words than what was on the screen, because it sounded like it would be like, where are you going? All that to say that.
What is the director now? When you see all this evolution of techniques, now everybody has a camera in his pocket, nerdy.
Yes, but see, that's only equipment.
Hmm?
You know, I mean, equipment, you know, it's like having, you know, it's like having a paintbrush. You know, any of us can have a paintbrush. There's only a few people that can know what to do with it. You know what I mean? Otherwise, it just becomes, I don't know what the world that is. And the same thing applies. If you're picking this up and you are using this to tell a story, you do have to tell a story. You have to deal with the actors. You have to deal with what the shots are like. You know, how long the shots, how quick or brief, or what is taking place and why am I watching this. All those decisions are the same. The equipment may change, but all of those elements are continuous.
The club of the director is getting bigger, but it's still a club.
It's still, you know, it's like anything else. We can all have a camera, and only some of us know how to take a picture. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, you look at some things like, you know, you're going to have some friend. Look at this. This is when we, now wait a minute, you can't quite see her, but you know, she's half off the shot. Why is that? You know what I mean? So it's part of, it's like anything else.
You mean it's not the director's club, it's a talent club, right?
It's the storytelling club. And how do you tell the story? And that just goes back to, you know, way before there was film and way before there was actors and way before anything. So you would assume that back in the age of, you know, cavemen, sometimes you're sitting around a fire, somebody was telling some story somehow. And it just keeps evolving.
The gifted one.
You know, somebody told the story.
Well,
you know?
They are all not gifted.
But Well, you tell the other caveman.
What is the part of improvisation in a film like The Bay? For example, in the realization and in the acting?
How's that again?
What's, how much is improvised on this movie? As much acting as well as directing?
I don't, you know, it's funny, I don't really know, because I just sort of like try to accomplish whatever I think should go in the scene. So I'm, at a certain point, you know, because I don't refer to the script between each take and go, well, you know, you didn't say, you know, this word or whatever, you know what I mean? I'm just, we're going to do the scene, and how credible is the scene? And sometimes we'll do a take, and I'll say, you know, it might be nice to mention this, this, and that, and then you'll just try it. And then you say, that's good, but you know what? And then you just keep working that way. So I don't know how much of it is. I have no clue.
And you do that on all movies? Even
Yeah.
whether it's The Bay or a period movie or...
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I just try to make it sound
Real.
real. So when my father said to me when the first time you know, I wrote and directed Diner, you know, and he said to me after seeing the movie, he said, I thought you wrote the movie. I said I did. He said, well, it sounds like everybody made it up. So that's all I'm trying to make it, and for me, mostly is to make it seem credible to my ear.
So you have a very reactive way of creating during the shooting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to
Very
impose. I don't want to impose. I don't want to impose something on it that may ultimately, you know, affect it adversely. So I'm trying to find ways for it to just live and breathe. At the same time, there are certain things that I want to get in terms of shots, etc. But I don't want to suddenly say, you know, you can't, don't turn your head. I want you to do it, you know what I mean? I don't want to do it that way because it becomes inhibiting. So I have to find a way to get what I want and have the actor feel as if they have total freedom. And that's the balancing act you do. So they think like, you know, there is, the best situation is they think there was no direction at all and there was nothing except I'm doing what I want to do. That's what you want to get to. However you can get to that point. Then it's going to have, it'll have the imperfection that I think is a sense of credibility.
Yeah. Of the reality.
Yeah.
Just could you tell us just a few words about Michael Walsh that wrote the script with you?
Yeah.
Who is it? Who is he? Excuse me.
He was my assistant. Mentioned Michael, and he is very smart, and I told him this thing here, and he's got a lot of background and understanding of the subject matter that we were doing, and I was talk to him, and then he would work on something, and then I'd say, well, you know, what we need to do, blah blah blah, whatever, and we would just keep fashioning it that way, so that we kind of knocked out this type of a piece. I think it's his first screenplay, I believe.
Last one? Yeah.
Last one, yes.
What's your next project?
If things work out, hopefully, I'm going to do a movie with Johnny Depp based on, it's called Black Mass, based on Whitey Bulger, who was an Irish, Boston Irish gangster, and his involvement with the FBI in the late 70s through the early 90s.
Okay.
And it's really it's a real scandal in terms of what happened with the FBI.
And he was arrested very recently, right?
He was just arrested. He was a fugitive for 16 years. He was the second most wanted man in the United States, next to Osama bin Laden.
Okay.
So.
Last one.
Yes.
We told us. You told us about an archaeological work about scenes. Welcome, Skype,
yeah.
you know.
how do you manage to coordinate all the things? That was probably difficult to editing all the things.
Vous voulez dire quoi? Vous voulez savoir comment il a décidé comment filmer quoi? Ou est-ce qu'il a tout filmé de toutes les manières et après il a choisi?
Voilà, en fait, et ensuite comment il a fait pour tout rassembler dans un film entier?
You said you wanted to proceed like it was found footage, right? So did you kind of use all the ways you could use for the scenes and then choose on which angle it looks the best, you know? I mean, for example, did you choose, this I'm going to shoot with this camera, this I'm going to shoot from surveillance camera, this I'm going to shoot from phone, you know? Did you decide beforehand which technique was going to be used for each moment?
Yeah.
Or did you use them all and then select what was best?
No, it would be laid out specifically. In other words, if
Non, il avait décidé d'avance qu'est-ce qui serait filmé comment.
a certain scene was going to be a surveillance camera, it was a surveillance camera. So everything was laid out in advance. The only variable is if we say in the swimming sequence, and you gave cameras to 4 kids, you know, in there, they were swimming around with the cameras. They're underwater and playing around because they were little waterproof cheap cameras. That you don't know. You don't know what they do.
Oui, il y a comme ça des cas où par exemple ils donnaient à des gamins qui se baignaient des caméras qui allaient sous l'eau. Là ils pouvaient pas savoir d'avance qu'ils allaient ramener. Mais généralement ils disaient cette scène c'est une caméra de surveillance, on s'y tient. C'est ce qu'ils disaient tout à l'heure par rapport à la véracité. Pour que ce soit crédible, il fallait que ce soit
Très
voilà. Oui,
c'est pour ça qu'en fait
voilà, donc à chaque plan il décidait la caméra elle sera là, elle sera sur le bateau, elle sera sous l'eau. Voilà. Mais il fallait s'en tenir, il ne pouvait pas mélanger justement. Parce que s'il n'y a que 2 personnes dans la pièce, il y a une seule caméra, il n'y en a pas 2.
Non, voilà, c'est ce que je veux préciser par rapport à tout à l'heure. Okay.
The one surprise would be is that you gave them the camera to shoot with, and then you found out that they actually had it on, and then when the scene began, they turned it off.
Il y a des cas où il a besoin de donner des caméras à des gamins, et la caméra tourne, mais à partir du moment où lui il dit moteur, eux ils ont éteint leur caméra.
So, that's what happened.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.